So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us online here at this evening's museum talk. And the museum talk is different than we wanted it to be because of the closing of all university buildings in Leiden. But I'm really happy that today you would be able to join us online here at the museum talk. And I'm also very happy that we will be joined here today by our guest speakers, Professor Ross Parry and Vince Dziekan. My name is Karin de Wild. I'm an assistant professor at Leiden University, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speakers to you of tonight, because they're going to discuss the evolving digital confidence within museums based on their involvement in multi-partner institutional initiatives, bringing together cultural organization, policy makers, academics, professional bodies, and also support in institutions and communities of practice. And within that large collaborative teams, they started to explore and also started to see how they could improve the digital transformation within museums. We know that digital technology has changed. It has changed the way that museums manage collections, have conduct research. We have seen how they changed how we shape exhibition and also how we build relationships with stakeholders and audiences. So the digital is no longer seen as something that has been developed outside of the museum, but we see that it is now fully incorporated within the museum itself, within its organization, its visions, and also its presentations. Yet still, museums need to constantly adapt to the fast-changing technologies of today. And this constant transformation makes that museums are not always feeling already confident enough to work with the digital and to be confident within this digital transformation process. So this talk will further reflect on the digital confidence within museums, why it had faltered at times, why it matters, and how it may flourish as part of the museum's post-digital future. So, as I said, I'm really proud that today I can welcome our guest speakers. First of all, Vince Dziekan, who is a senior academic at Monash Art Design and Architecture Department, MADA. And together with Ross Parry, he's the series editor of a newly launched book series with Routledge entitled Critical Perspectives on Museums and Digital Technology. And Vince's work engages with the transformation of contemporary curatorial practices at the intersection of emergent design practices, creative technology, and museum culture. And the scope of his interdisciplinary investigations was outlined in several publications, but among others, Virtuality and the Art of Exhibition, Curatorial Design for the Multimedia Museum, which was published by the University of Chicago Press, and more recently within the Routledge Handbook of Museums, Media and Communication, which was co-edited by Kirsten Dottner. Ross Parry is a professor of museum technology and director of the Institute for Digital Culture at the University of Leicester, but he's also former Tate Research Fellow and former chair of the United Kingdom's National Museums Computer Group. Ross' publications include key works within the field of digital museology, for example, the work Recoding the Museum, Digital Heritage and Technologies of Change, published by Routledge, but also the work Museums in a Digital Age. And most recently, he also indeed co-edited the Handbook of Museums, Media and Communication. So since 2017, he has been leading the One by One initiative, which is a major arts and humanities research council funded research project, which involves governmental and professional bodies across the UK, but also across the US, that is focused on developing digital confident museums. So how this evening is going to work is that, first of all, we will have a presentation by both Vince Dziekan and Ross Parry, who have joined us online here. Welcome. And after that, we will open the floor for questions. Please feel free to already put them in the chat, and we will then collect them and make sure they are asked to our speakers afterwards. So Vince Dziekan and Ross Parry, the floor is yours.
Tell us when you're happy.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, welcome back. For those of you that didn't hear, let's reintroduce ourselves, and I'll say again what we said in our first kind of take on this, that we're We're coming from a different venue today because we respect the right of everyone on a university campus and in society more generally, in a democratic society, to express their views, and in this case around climate emergency. So we were more than content to step aside and make room for that protest to be seen and to be heard, and to make the disruption in the case that it made on campus at the University of Leiden today. Over the next half hour, we'd like to reflect upon what we think are key characteristics that university-led research and university-partnered research can have in the 21st century in the area of digital culture. In kind of conversation in front of you over these few minutes, we'd like to think about the role that purposeful research has within the digital culture complex. We'd like to think about what research action means and what practice-led research can do in this arena. We'd like to share with you the example of one particular project that we were part of, we had the privilege to be part of, around digital confidence building within part of the culture sector, and how that animates for us the value of taking an international approach, taking a transdisciplinary approach, taking a purposeful and actionable approach. What that will hopefully help us to see are some of the ways in which our new Institute for Digital Culture at the University of Leicester, how that is animating all of these, mobilizing these characteristics. And what Vince and I would like to do is to take you through some of the ideas we have around building an international research observatory and an international research academy. We'll end by showing how you can get involved, and the international book series, Critical Perspectives on Museums and New Technology. So a conversation about a new institute, a conversation about some new international hubs and points of collaboration, a conversation about a new book series, but ultimately a reflection about what it is to do research in the 21st century within the digital culture complex. Well, let's begin then by thinking about some of those ideas around purposefulness. The Institute for Digital Culture is one of 5 new institutes that the University of Leicester has established just in the last couple of years. The university is 100 years old. As part of its centenary, it has done a remarkable thing. It has invested in 100, in fact, in the end, 150 fully funded doctoral projects right across the university, from life science to criminology, from media and communication to our School of Arts, from museum studies to our law school. There are 100 scholars now, fresh, fearless, early career doctoral students that are exploring all aspects of those challenges in the 21st century, where Leicester knows that its students and its staff can be citizens of change, as we call it. As well as establishing those 100 scholarships, we've also established 5 institutes that speak to what we consider 5 global challenges where Leicester can make a contribution. Our new Institute of Space reaffirms Leicester's place centrally in the UK space industry. Something from Leicester has been in space every year for the last 50 years, and under the direction of our extraordinary institute director, Professor Emma Bunce, the Institute for Space continues to put Leicester with its new space park at the centre of that work. Our Institute for Structural and Chemical Biology helps us to understand the fundamental building blocks of life. And again, Leicester's extraordinary and unique infrastructure and the tools that other universities come to Leicester to use positions that institute as something that can make a profound contribution to understanding our bodies in the 21st century. Our Institute for Environmental Futures, led by Professor Heiko Balzer, working with global organizations and NGOs, using near-Earth observation to understand and to evidence climate change and to understand what human beings are doing to this planet. Bringing together colleagues from computer science to geography and geology, from sociology to politics and international relations, understanding the future of this planet. Precision medicine. Our Institute for Precision Medicine will be part of that movement that will beat cancer in this century, in our lifetime. It will be precision medicine designed for our individual genetic makeup, for our particular condition, that reason why healthcare in the 21st century will change. Leicester, again, at the center of that conversation. And so, the future of travel and human beings in our universe, us understanding our body, us understanding the future of health and well-being, us understanding our place on this planet and the impact that we have as human beings in the Anthropocene on this planet. Our final institute is an institute that reflects upon culture, but culture inflected through the lens of digitality, this dataful, networked condition that we find ourselves in the 21st century. And it's our privilege to be part of that institute. So when we establish a new research institute in a university in a new century, what can we do? We think what we can do is make it useful. We think the most important thing is to ensure that the outputs and the insights from that institute are used. We're not interested in writing books that no one reads. We're not interested in writing white papers that sit on a desk and never have an impact. We're not interested in writing reports that just gather dust. We're interested in actionable, purposeful research that can make a difference to our society. So, at the heart of our new Institute for Digital Culture is the concept of purposeful research. This means academics need to do something systemically very different. We're turning the model around. So that model that maybe starts with the professor in her desk, at her desk in her office, following her trajectory of research and hoping that that next book will be perhaps a book that makes an impact. We turn that around. We flip that system around. And rather than leading, we might follow. Rather than telling, we begin by listening. So for the Institute for Digital Culture, at the heart of it is a capability around purposefulness. Working with Vince and Monash University and other partners around the world, we're building an international network of digital culture research observatories from Canada to the US, from the UK to across Europe and around Asia Pacific. We're bringing together policy bodies, we're bringing together government organizations, professional associations, communities of practice, different cultural organizations and cultural leaders and thought leaders. And those organizations, those individuals are going to help us to do three things. They're going to help us to identify need, evidence need, identify sources of funding and resource, and then help us to convene talent. So the projects that we put together are always responding to evidence points of need, because the Institute is there to help the culture sector globally adapt to the digital age. But it will always do that in partnership with that culture sector telling us where to go, that culture sector being co-researchers all the way through. Vince, I guess another kind of key capability then within the Institute isn't just how we identify those points of need, but it's then the methods we follow. And at the heart of that is your conceptual framing around research action.
Thanks, Ross. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be here tonight, even in these these beautiful surrounds. Yeah, in terms of sort of the way of conducting this program of research, this is where I guess we recognize the importance of being actionable, and in that way recognizing the relationship that practice has to research. We had a great conversation earlier today with some other academic colleagues here at the University of Leicester. And, that conversation finds a common ground through practice, practice in its various forms, practice that finds its way into a research process at the beginning, middle, end. Practice becomes a bit of a lingua franca for the way that we can understand each other across disciplines. So in terms of where my research background comes from, I come from a practice-based discipline space. I come from the visual arts, creative arts more broadly, which especially in the context of the UK and Australia in particular, where I'm based, we have actually institutionalized practice-based research within academia. And we recognize, of course, that that's not the case necessarily in every other domain. It's very much a case where, practice, especially in terms of, the visual arts, design, architecture, the fields that I'm sort of practice, which is the practice that I sort of employ in my own work. We recognize that the creative outlet, the creative outcome of a research process, is in some ways undiluted. It's kind of where the research, is most tangibly manifest. And of course, in academia, that may not always be the final point. It may need to be re-articulated in some way, again, depending on the institutional framework or the type of PhD program, perhaps, or even within the particular sort of academic legislative domain. So the way that research is measured, right? So again, research action becomes a way for us to think about working with cultural sector organizations, working with a common understanding of practice being something that we all do, right? So somebody who's a curator working in a museum, somebody who's an educator, somebody who's a designer who kind of actually is kind of brought into a museum to work on a project, an artist who contributes the work to that sector. You know, practice becomes a common point for us to understand what we're doing together. And it may also mean that we actually kind of conduct, therefore, research on its terms, you know, on the terms that are needed within that particular sector. And that's what, again, through the Institute and through the types of projects that we're mobilizing and the way that we're mobilizing that conversation as well, you know, we feel that that becomes a really important approach, and it distinguishes our research program in many respects. So this is where I guess we can talk a little bit more specifically about an example that might help sort of ground that, and that relates to this theme of digital confidence.
So from 2017 through to just last year, the University of Leicester has been part of a major international consortium that has been responding to a point of need and following research action. So here's a really tangible recent example of those ideas of purposeful research and research action being illustrated. It was back in 2014 that training providers from around the world gathered in Baltimore as part of the Museums and the Web series of conferences, and trainers from Greece to Australia to Canada and across Europe and across the US gathered together for a special workshop moment within the program to reflect upon what were the skills that the museum sector would need in the 21st century, and were we developing the right sort of digital competencies within our workforce. The principles that we identified, the Baltimore principles as they were framed, they showed us that we'd probably been asking the wrong question for many decades, that actually there wasn't one single path to digital maturation within the museum sector, that actually each museum would need to develop its own journey, its own path to digital maturity within its own context. That actually it wasn't about an IT few within the organization taking on the responsibility of doing digital, that it was probably every worker's responsibility within the museum workforce. And that actually the skills required would be entirely dependent upon that situation and that particular locale. And they would evolve over time. There wouldn't be one single curriculum that all curators would need to know, but each year, each decade, that skill set would need to evolve. It was 2 years later in Los Angeles that the group came together and framed an idea for a project that would do just that. And by 2017, running right the way through to 2022, through a series of funded projects by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, and then subsequently by a National Endowment for Humanities grant in the US, the One by One project was purposeful research and research action in action. The project brought together multiple organizations, and we're very grateful to Dr. Hytham Eid from Southern University in New Orleans, a historically Black college and university, who was instrumental in framing the third iteration of the project that was really framing on questions around inequity and social and racial injustice within the museum tech space. But we're also grateful for the initiator with us at the very beginning of the project, Carolyn Royston, who is now at the Brooklyn Museum, but was then at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, the Smithsonian Institution. We were able to identify a number of kind of concepts across the organization related to interfaces related to the way that we organize collections. And we'll tell you a little bit about the insights that we've gained around approaches to organization. The illustration here, by the way, is simply just to, to illustrate some of the thinking. This isn't, don't worry too much about digging into the detail. What we were able to do by working with our partners in National Museum Scotland, National Museum Wales and Good for Cymru, working with the V&A, working with the Science Museum, working with Derby Museums, Bright Museum, working with the Museum of London, National Army Museum, Smithsonian American Art Museum, the American Women's History Museum, the National Air and Space Museum, and the Smithsonian Design Museum, Cooper Hewitt. What we were able to do by having fellows embedded in those organizations across the project was to understand what needed to change in museums for them to build digital confidence. The first thing we noted was that each museum needed to define digital on its own terms. And what we could see within the museum sector is that digital can mean different things. Sometimes when we refer to digital, we mean the technology. So digital is something we use. Sometimes we mean digitalization. We mean the process of changing the business model and adopting digital systems and tools and processes. But sometimes digital means digitizing, creating digital things, producing digital things, or collecting digital things in the world. The museum uniquely has that relationship, and that distinguishes it from other industries. But perhaps the real differentiator from other industries, whether that's gas and oil, finance, pharmaceuticals, leisure, publishing, broadcast, or whatever, is that the museum sector is also not just using, managing, collecting and creating, but it's also understanding digital. The role of the museum in the world is to be the narrator of our digital condition, to understand what it means to be in a digital age. What is AI doing to us? What has been the impact of mobile and so on? Being able to come up with these clear framings was a real insight, and those framings and those insights into being able to articulate the contextual nature of digital change was very important to us. A couple of other things that emerged that was so important from this project, as well as contextual being a key word, taking a holistic approach. So digital change will happen because of each institution understanding its own circumstances, but it will also happen when that institution thinks about its whole organization. So what we were able to see through our different research projects was that for digital change to take place, it needed to be embedded within the vision of the organization, but it also needed to be embedded within the leadership and the leaderful behavior of the organization, as well as the systems and processes in the organization, as well as the culture of the organization and the way that each individual is empowered. It's vision that initiates digital change. It's leadership that activates that change. It's systems and processes that supports and enables that change, as does the culture. But it's people ultimately that drives digital change. So if you go to the Digital Culture Compass today, and in fact this week a new element, the Wayfinder tool, has been added just in the last 48 hours. If you go to Digital Culture Compass, an incredible platform supported by Arts Council of England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund, you'll see that organisations, the Audience Agency, the Space, Culture 24, and the University of Leicester's 1x1 project have built this free resource that has the principles, definitions, framings, ideas of the 1x1 project embedded within it. Go on that site and you're taken through a structured conversation that helps you as an individual, you as a team, or you as a whole organization understand where digital lives within your organization. But it helps you to think about the whole framings of your organization, the whole functions of your organization, but also the foundational elements of your organization. You shine a light into every room. And then at the end, it helps you to see a heat map, not just of where digital is, but where digital needs to be, or where you want digital to be in your organization. So there it is. There's an example of the 1x1 project, listening to what the sector needed. The sector said, we don't have the digital skills to meet our own ambitions and the expectations of our audiences. So we brought the industry together, the professional bodies, the government agencies, the leading organizations, the academics, and we produced resources that have made a difference and will make a real impact on any organization going forward now, any museum organization that wants to understand its digital literacy. Vince, I guess there are other examples, and maybe thinking about some of your own work and some of the the editing that you've been doing with some of our recent authors around actions also impacted upon the way we think about exhibitions and communication?
Exactly. That's kind of where, with what Ross was just saying, all of that sort of a way that digital confidence is kind of built and the way it's enabled, happening kind of inside the organization. Of course, if we think about the way that confidence manifests itself, how does that actually become kind of externalized? How does that actually sort of operate across the interface that museums have? Museums, of course, are organizations that have, inner workings. They have their own sort of internal organizational cultures. They sort of operate in particular ways. They're kind of, in some respect, a world unto themselves. But of course, they're worlds inside of worlds. And, the way that we move between the inside and the outside of a museum has become increasingly porous. That's a concept that I've had the pleasure of kind of developing with Nancy Proctor, who's actually one of our authors in an upcoming book on digital confidence, where we've talked about the idea of the pervasive museum, the idea that the museum interface is one that we can see, moving between inside and outside in very, very fluid ways. And sometimes the museum starts on the inside and manifests itself publicly through things like exhibition. In other ways, we might find that the outside comes into the museum, and that might also be where processes, new processes come into play, such as co-design with communities, different ways that we actually sort of think about the way that collection data is kind of inflected in a different way by, co-designing or kind of working in a more citizen science way. So there's a range of different ways of thinking about this interface that museums have and how that digital confidence manifests itself across that. I mentioned very briefly Nancy Proctor. Nancy is a person who's based currently in Baltimore. She's now director of the Peel Center. And actually the project that she talks about in our upcoming book is actually where her movement from working inside of a museum, she worked at the Smithsonian, leading their digital programs at the Smithsonian, to actually becoming a chief experience officer in this new organization in Baltimore, to becoming the director, and how that digital confidence manifests itself through the way of engaging community in this particular museum. And that makes the Peel a very distinctive place, is the way that community engagement and community involvement is actually baked in to the way that curatorial processes are actually conducted. And again, those curatorial processes manifest themselves in conventional formats, programming, exhibitions, but they also have a very important sort of digital outlet, but they're also informed by digital confidence. Another project that we speak about in that upcoming book, we have curator Sarah Cook working through ways that she engaged with a series of projects that actually spanned the COVID sort of period. So a project that began working with new media art in an exhibition format at the Somerset House in London, an exhibition called 24/7, that actually in a second manifestation had to pivot to becoming an online project that became a project called Sleep Mode. And again, the ability curatorially to kind of navigate between those two spaces was, again, a really interesting example of how museums have come out of the COVID period now, thinking about digital perhaps in a different way. And again, that becomes a particularly interesting case study that, of course, is drawn from practice as well. And the final example that we talk about in the section that's dedicated to interface in this upcoming book engages a research lab based in Vancouver called the Making Cultures Lab, that's run by Kate Hennessy. And she engages with First Nation artists and deals with the ideas around digital repatriation. So this whole lab is really based on, again, how digital can also provide a different way of thinking about the way that cultural organizations actually engage with artists and, again, communities. in a very, very distinctive way. So those are three that do speak to the way, again, that practice, whether it's practice in a research mode, which engages with visual, sort of visual ethnography, video making, digitization, in the case of the Making Cultures Lab, whether it's curatorial practice in the context of Sarah's work with respect to those exhibition projects, and again, whether it comes even to the level of a museum director who actually has reconceived an entire museum, informed again through practice, those become sort of manifestations of some of the concepts that we've just been alluding to. I recognize that we also have a number of things to cover, so I'm not going to kind of really go in great depth into this sort of slide that we've got here, but this is in a sense a visualization that tries to kind of track the way that that interface, okay, has actually kind of evolved, and the way that that interface kind of moves between these different sort of poles of digital sort of tracking through the way that sort of museums kind of more traditionally or conventionally operate. And it forms part, I guess, of what we're also very interested in sort of mobilizing is while we're talking about digital, in some ways, digital has been kind of a time that we have moved through, and that we find ourselves actually operating increasingly in a time and a place and in a way that is far more post-digital. And that again challenges us to think about, right, the way that we understand, the way that we work digitally and in sort of, let's say, analog modes as well. Might sort of hand back to you to kind of complete the triad that we've kind of sort of introduced there, which again reflects the structure in fact of this upcoming book, focused on a section on organization, interface, and collection. So might be a bit of an outro from that.
An outro for that. So just recapping then. So a principle of purposeful research, doing research that's focused on responding to need, willing to follow that research in a practice-led way, in an actionable way, in organizations, with organizations, for organizations, those cultural organizations having agency and ownership and leadership over these research projects. It's enabled us to do a few things here. It's enabled us to be part of and to orchestrate and coordinate a project, an international project like One by One, which has given us those new framings and vocabularies and practical tools to help any organization reflect upon its digital confidence. It's also helped us to build that complex, that theoretical framework around the post-digital, which Vince has been, helping you to see through the example of sort of exhibition and interface and communication. And what is it to be communicating and programming and producing provision in a post-digital way today? One other example we wanted to share with you is, that digital confidence not just coming through coordinated approaches to projects, not just coming through a mature theorization, in this case, the post-digital. But another example is around collections. And it's thinking about what happens when that actionable, purposeful research is able to do something at scale and to do something of real significance within the sector. The illustration here is for a new initiative that launched at the Museums Association conference in the UK just a couple of weeks ago, which is called the Museum Data Service. The Museum Data Service is an extraordinary act of research action and purposeful research. It absolutely embodies a post-digital moment of digital confidence within the museum sector. It goes something like this. To take the UK example, there are 80 million records in the 1,700 accredited museums in the UK, according to research and calculations by the Collections Trust. 80 million lines of object records in databases and collection management systems. However, despite several decades of digitization and digitalization, so making those records digital and creating organizations that are digitally confident, less than half of those 80 million records are surfaced on the web, are visible, are searchable to a researcher, to a school child, to a member of your community around your museum. This is because it's difficult to technically connect those collections. It's because it's hard to muster and convene and bring those organizations around one single endeavor of connectivity. For some of those questions around legality and GDPR and rights and all of those questions that preoccupy us now in the digital space. Consequently, those organizations have never felt they have the resource, the capability, or the capacity to get those tens of millions of collections visible and online. It was 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, that voices were calling at Museums Association annual general meetings for a single inventory of all UK museum collections, thinking that that would be something we could do to have a list of all museum objects. And here we are a century later, and we still don't have it. We still don't have it until now. So thanks to successful investment from Bloomberg Philanthropies and their International Digital Accelerator Fund that was secured by Art UK, and thanks to the support of the Collections Trust and now the partnership with the Institute for Digital Culture, the Museum Data Service is a landmark act of creating a fair repository of museum data. And by fair, we mean findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Please have a look at museumdata.uk and follow the story and find out about what we've built and what we're going to continue to build over the coming years. This will change the way that our publics and our researchers encounter museum data. It will use the best insights that we've learned from the last 10 years about how to connect and link data together. It will draw upon the confidence and coalescence that we have, the professionalism and trust that organizations like the Collections Trust build within our sector, the new forms of collaboration and purposeful action. But it also recognizes the role that universities can have in this space. Universities that have the infrastructure can look after large data sets at scale in a secure and trusted way. So please, the Museum Data Service as another example of purposeful action. To kind of bring this to a close, Vince, we've tried to have a conversation here about how we're framing and we're taking different methods and different approaches, highly international, highly responsive and purposeful, highly interdisciplinary, very much based upon action. The research program that we're putting together in the Institute for Digital Culture, we're excited, I guess, by not just the observatories that I talked about before, but we're excited about the publications that are going to illustrate that, but also the academy kind of idiom that's within that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's not going to be me telling about it. It'll be about us kind of, sort of working it through together and sort of talking through some of these examples. Yeah. Ross and I, again, sort of as part of the programming of the Institute for Digital Culture and kind of thinking about what that research program distinctively sort of looks like and what it kind of is made up of. We've in effect kind of curated, the content of that program, the way that program is going to function. It's kind of curatorial playbook, if you will, in terms of the approach. So there's multiple kind of aspects that I guess demonstrate, those principles that we were just talking about, the principles of purposeful research, actionable research, and again, ideas such as digital confidence, how they manifest that. So we've mentioned the book series, which is called Critical Perspectives on Museums and Digital Technology, which is a new book series with Routledge. There are 4 upcoming books that are all set for publication in 2024. They've all been at various stages of development over the past year. And of course, there's a number of other books also in the pipeline. But in terms of what you can expect to find over the coming months, you will find books that come out focusing on digital transformation, books focusing on the history of computing, a book focusing on digital confidence that we've just talked about, and another book focusing on design practices, museums and design practices. And that suite of books kind of is quite distinctive in our estimation, and also I guess our publisher's estimation, because we're tackling digital not necessarily as kind of the only reference point we're actually bringing in those ideas of kind of purposefulness and actionableness, into that discourse as well. And that's where, again, upcoming books around sort of, again, digital equity as an example, books on inclusive museum practice, again, that agenda. So the book series, while again, we were talking before about practice and actually recognizing practice as kind of a fundamental outlet for research, these are books, they are words on a page, but importantly, they're actually books that are bringing and giving voice to practitioner-based and practitioner-led understandings that have been gained from work that has been done, and has therefore used the book as a way of processing that. So again, maybe in terms of the digital confidence book that we were just talking about, I kind of alluded to the sort of chapters that are there in the interface section, but you were referring to the organizational aspects in terms of the actual kind of content that is making up that section of that particular book. I think they're also illustrative of this idea of research action demonstrated in a particular way.
Yeah, we've got, because those principles Vince are talking about there, that, we've tried to identify first-time authors, we've tried to identify and be aware of a diversity of authors. We're trying to understand, what does expertise sound like and look like. We're also realizing that there is exceptional talent and insight within, the museum workforce that isn't always heard within sort of traditional academic publishing. So the opening chapter of the book is from Carolyn Royston, reflecting upon her work around digital leadership. Carty Price from the V&A, Dathys James, formerly from National Museum Wales and Good for Cymru, reflecting upon their work, understanding new systems and processes for digital change in museums. But also, in that opening section, you'll see extraordinary piece on emotional intelligence and emotional labor from Dr. Sophie Frost. So, an early career researcher who, is an absolute sort of firework within our sector. Such a privilege to make sure that the book series gives Sophie a platform to start sharing her extraordinary work. She does microethnographies within organizations, and she's able to notice for us that digital confidence and digital change doesn't just come about because of new business processes and new technologies, but it comes out through emotional intelligence as well. And understanding the emotionality, the affective dimension, the emotional turn that's taking place both within our practice and our study of the subject. So Sophie's work, when you're able to see that, it reflects upon, for instance, hidden labor, gendered labor, distributed labor within the museum. So again, what we're trying to do right across our new kind of approach is challenge some of the systemic givens and axiomatic truths within academic approaches to this subject. We're listening, not always leading. We're being purposeful. We're taking practice-based approaches, not always traditional academic approaches. We're building things at scale, infrastructures, not just producing traditional outputs. And in terms of those academic publications, even within the book series itself, it's a short format book. It's a fast publication that's responsive to discourses now. We're being careful about understanding, inclusively and diversely and equitably, who are the voices? What does expertise look like? So at every step of the way, with the new Institute for Digital Culture, but also this collective approach that we're taking to digital culture research here in Leiden, but also in Leicester as well, and in Monash, we think this is becoming a vehicle for us to reflect on some more profound questions about not just what does digital culture research look like in the 21st century, but what does scholarship look like in the 21st century? Why is it there? What it's responding to, what methods it uses, how it collaborates, the values it has within it, and what comes out of it, the outputs and insights it produces, and how they find their use. So a conversation there about an institute, but hopefully a conversation there also about digital culture as an area of research and scholarship more widely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have to put on off the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and Ross. And thank you. Please put your questions within the chat, and then we can start the conversation. So I'm sitting here, that's why I switched. Yeah. So the first question is actually on the chat.
Yes. Thank you very much for that question. First, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really exceptional how driven you are and how indeed that future side of scholarship and digital scholarship is so well explored already. So I was totally impressed. Although I was very nervous, but thanks for behind that. But now also the question, of course. So the question is more or less, if we love art so much, why don't we make art? I really like the question. So we do have, of course, in Leiden that opportunity to have a double degree. So on the one hand, you can do art as an artist and art as an art historian, analyze and study that. So it is already possible in the BA. In the MA, we do have, of course, a practice-based thesis, but what we do want more generally is that, of course, you need to relate to what you feel. Of course, you need to prepare of what a curator has in a museum, for example. So we don't educate artists. We do educate art historians who do know what work and field is about. But with that double degree, there's still an opportunity to become an artist and an art historian. So I hope that was more or less an answer to your question. And sorry, I couldn't see who asked it because it's a bit dark on the screen. So, but we do honor speakers to have questions. Are there? But I give the floor to you because I think that the questions are dropping in.
They are dropping in. Yeah, so there are also questions dropping in for you, Ross and Vince now. So we're going to open up indeed the floor for questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll make sure that we'll bring them to Ross and Vince. So first of all, I see here in the chat a question by Isa van Schaik, and she is asking, first of all, thank you for your inspiring talk, but I was wondering on a personal and professional level, do you feel like the approaches you highlighted, did it make you better researchers as well?
Absolutely. Hopefully we can be heard now.
Yeah,
I think what you need to do is...
No, it's okay. It's okay. I've already opened it. So I think
This is all good. I'm happy to jump in first.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly. I think from my part, it hopefully gives me humility and integrity as a researcher. So by having a sense of expertise that I might have, but always recognizing that there's other expertise and there's more expertise around me. I think taking an international perspective constantly helps us to challenge the assumptions we might have about knowledge construction, about the role of the museum, about technological infrastructure, about scholarship. I think by taking a action-based research, it means that we have to understand how we do our work within other people's settings and other communities. So we constantly think about questions around, equity and access. So for me, being purposeful, being action-based, being international, and being interdisciplinary, to be in a constant interdisciplinary mode is to constantly acknowledge that there are other people with different disciplinary perspectives in the room who will have a different set of preconditions that they're working from, different set of methods, different vocabulary, and may have a different outcome they're heading towards. So you constantly listen, you constantly accommodate, you constantly slow down and understand and empathize with those around you. So for me, being internationalist, being empathetic, constantly thinking about equity, constantly questioning the assumptions I might be making, that undoubtedly, I think makes me a better scholar. But I don't know, Vince, what's yours?
Well, I'd say yes. I concur. I echo exactly what you said. I think the interdisciplinary kind of aspect is really important in that. And I think I mentioned it in the talk. Practice and recognizing that there are many different ways of practicing, but practice is an element. It opens us up thinking about how do we sort of relate our practice across, how do we understand and sort of absorb insights that come from other practices as well. That's a really important thing. And I guess it makes me think about sort of actually how digital factors into all of this as well, because of course digital technology and digital as a subject is relatively new to academia. Where does digital fit? And I think anybody who would look back at kind of their sort of academic sort of context would see, well, where do you find digital located, in let's say a university structure? And there has always been, from day one, a sense that is it in information technology or computer science, because that's kind of the technology aspect, that's how it's made. That's where the coding, where the systems are developed. But of course, it's also in media studies, right? So it kind of is in the space where it's about, okay, how is that technology now changing the way that communication works and the nature of kind of the economies that exist around that, production-wise and consumption-wise. And of course, it exists in fields like digital media and kind of creative technology, where it's like, what are people doing with that technology? What kind of things are they creating with it? And so again, the nature, in some respects, of what we're talking about is a bit of a reference point. The idea of digital is by very nature one that kind of requires us to kind of be able to kind of see it in all those different lights. And again, I think what Ross was mentioning earlier, especially around the way that you understand digital confidence, the recognizing again of it kind of taking its different sort of manifestations in terms of being a skill or being a literacy, moving through those different sort of inflections is also a really important thing to recognize. So I guess that sort of ability to navigate and be agile within that, recognizing the relationality that exists at all times within that, that's also a really important thing that I think does by nature improve your sense of research and how to conduct research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And we have another question coming in, which is not from me. It's from Martin Berger, who is here with us as well. And Martin is asking, and I'm just going to read it for you. But Martin is asking what the role is of social engagement and social justice in purposeful research, and also within research actions. And we're also wondering in particular about the role of the global south in your programs. Considering that you mentioned the Pacific, North America, Europe, but not South Asia or Latin America.
Yeah.
Is it true that that is missing, or what kind of role do you play?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that, because yes, it's missing, but it won't be. We have to start somewhere, and we chose with the funding opportunities that arose for us and the projects that started with us. You've heard about a UK US kind of collaboration, and now a collaboration with an Australian university, and because of our work with Surface Impression and Galleries Ontario in Canada, funded by the Canada Council for the Arts, that's another kind of global north kind of context there as well. We've started with the organizations that we have those connections, but the projects that we're now starting to see blossom and grow within the Institute for Digital Culture are intentionally disrupting that and challenging that. A new PhD student that's starting with us, Miriam, she's one of our future 100, future 50 scholars that have been funded by the Institute. She's working with Idil Osman. Idil Osman is a fantastic academic in development studies who focuses on Black diasporic identity building around cultural heritage. So the project that we're working on there is looking at the way in which young people, diasporic communities, young people coming from North Africa are using reference to cultural heritage culture within social media spaces. It's an extraordinary intersectional project about how does identity building work for young people in social media? How do young people leverage their cultural heritage within that? And specifically within the context of kind of young Black diasporic communities as well. That project is intentionally challenging and disrupting, importantly, and broadening and reframing assumptions and approaches that have been taken in some of the existing projects we've had. But most importantly, it's because Idil is an outstanding scholar and Miriam is an outstanding doctoral candidate. We will do more, and we need to do more, and we know that the work with Monash and with our Australian partners will help us to see, particularly whether that's in an Australian context or a New Zealand context, the experience of First Nations people, Aboriginal communities, as well, and how understanding kind of cultural difference and cultural diversity and challenging the kind of whiteness, patriarchy, global north that is kind of embedded within some of our traditional academic structures and approaches to digital culture needs to be kind of blown out. And I have to say that the third one by one project, that Lahaitham Eid was co-leading on, Stephanie Cunningham at Museum Hugh. If any of you don't know about Museum Hugh and what they do, please have a look at their work. Bringing together African American, Latinx experiences within the technology, culture, and creative spaces. We've been learning so much from Stephanie and her community about who's not in the room when it comes to some of these developments around museum technology. So yes, it isn't there as much as it should, but that's on us now, and that's on us to for me to sit here as a white, middle-aged, privileged man to notice that and to start modeling behavior that does something about that. Very, very quickly then on those social justice questions, where is social justice within it? I think it's a great example would be a new project that we're part of, led by Professor Hannah Thompson, Royal Holloway, University of London, but also with Anne Schick at the University of Lincoln and Alison Eardley at Westminster. So this is bringing together critical disability studies, psychology, design studies, and museum studies. And the Sensational Museum project, please go and have a look at that online as well, is a project that is calling out, confronting, disassembling the ableism that exists within our digital infrastructure within cultural organizations. So whether that's the approach to exhibition design in a number of different cultural organizations, or it's the approach to collections management and the act of documenting an object, the extent to which those data models and those interfaces are ableist. They make certain sensory assumptions. So there is a very powerful, burning social justice agenda at the heart of the Sensational Museum project, and we are very proud to be supporting that research. I hope that answers.
So thank you so much, Ross, Vince. We're getting at the end of the museum talk for tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for your attention. And thank you all once again, Vince Dziekan and Ross Parry, for this museum talk. I apologize shortly because we had some technical issues. That is because our university buildings have been closed tonight because of some actions of Extinction Rebellion. So we had to improvise on that. So thank you for bearing with us on that. But thank you all for your attention, and we'll see you next time at the museum talk.